The New York Times recently published this article about programmers at Amazon complaining that their jobs were beginning to look like warehouse work because of AI. Their managers were turning the screws on them. They were saying you should be using AI to get more done in lesser and lesser amounts of time. And this is where the comparison with blue-collar warehouse workers comes in. These programmers are now saying that they feel like bystanders in their own jobs. And they're making the same argument that factory and warehouse workers have been making for a long time, that their jobs have been stripped of all creativity, all craft, and it has just become very mechanized and repetitive and soul-crushing. And so these quote unquote white collar programmers are now feeling the same pressures that mechanical factory work has been feeling for almost the last century, since the dawn of the industrial age. The reason I'm making this video is that I want to tie back these recent developments to some very old ideas. In fact, the very birth of the field of software engineering, and hopefully expose some common themes that have been repeating in the field of software engineering since the very beginning. Let's start here. So back in 2013, more than a decade ago, I wrote this blog post, which was at the time a reaction to some prominent bloggers talking about blue-collar coders, how the work of web development and software development in general can and should be thought of as blue-collar work. Here is Anil Dash. Here is Anil Dash writing back in 2012. By the way, I couldn't even find this URL live anymore. I had to go to the Wayback Machine to find it. And he is making the case for software engineering to be treated as vocational education. We need web dev VOTech, as in vocational technology. And here is Laurie Voss making a similar argument about how knowledge workers should think of themselves more as blue-collar workers. And here he's making the crucial comparison to factory work and Taylorism. As he's saying here, think about how a physical factory worked. It worked because some highly skilled people first got together, examined the process of building a car, and then codified it. The blue-collar workers that were working in the factory only knew a tiny piece of how to build the car. And Voss here is arguing for that same model to be applied to web development. And this is an argument that can be applied to any technology that's fairly mature, where the ways of doing things and the ways of achieving a certain outcome or building a certain product are well understood and well known. So it's not surprising that even back in 2012, when web development was already pretty established with a fairly well understood stack, that he would make an argument like this. I wrote a blog post at the time reacting to these two posts, where I'm making the opposite case, saying that it's not tenable to think of software development purely as a vocational line of work, simply because of the pace at which technology changes. I'll link to all these down in the description if you want to go read them and get all the background. But the core philosophy that all these people are talking about is Taylorism. And Taylorism is deeply linked also to the birth of software engineering. So here's a blog post I wrote back in 2011, almost 15 years ago. And Taylorism is a deep topic in and of itself, but if you were to drastically simplify it, The core ideas of Taylorism are these two, that you measure everything, you bring metrics to all aspects of the work you're doing, and that you separate thinking from doing. This is similar to the point that Voss was making when comparing software development work to what happens in a car factory. So someone thinks about, examines, and codifies a process, that is the thinking part, and they then bring in an army of laborers to do tiny bits of that process. Where this links up to software engineering is that back in 1968, the very term software engineering was coined at a NATO conference of the top people that were building computers and writing software at the time. And they coined this term. They coined the term software engineering at this 1968 NATO conference. And one of the central themes of philosophies that the attendees were discussing in this conference was the notion of industrializing the process of building and writing software. Doug McIlroy expressed this by saying the software industry is not industrialized, and compared it to mass production techniques that were being used in physical factories. He's calling for a catalog of interchangeable parts with well-known, well-understood characteristics, and then using the same methods that we use for physical assembly in factories to be applied for the assembly and creation of software. So all this is to say that the very birth of the field of software engineering was rooted in a deep desire to make it Taylorist, to make it like factory work, more predictable, more routine, more dependable. Another lens through which you can view this entire argument is what I like to call the notion of operation versus expression. I'll link to this blog post below. Again, very old blog post. But the key idea is that there are times when you're operating a piece of machinery and the goal of operation is to quickly achieve some well-defined end. But then there are other times where you're not operating something, you're trying to express yourself. And this goes back to the notion of looking at what you're doing as a craft. Software engineers like to talk about how they craft their software. Looking at it as a craft or as a factory business oriented activity. So are you trying to operate a piece of machinery, or are you trying to express yourself and craft and create something? And this argument comes up again and again in the software industry whenever there's a big shift in the way we build software. Even when IDEs were becoming popular, this notion that IDEs are taking the craft away from software engineering was very widely expressed. A lot of software engineers thought that IDEs are constraining the way that they can write software. And this argument is now, of course, coming up again because AI, once again, is fundamentally changing the way we write software. But the point of this whole rant is that going back to the very birth of the field of software engineering, we've wanted to make it industrial. We've wanted to make it Taylorist. And there has been a steady stream of developments going back to compilers and then IDEs and high-level languages and now finally AI that have made us steadily march in that direction. All right, thanks.